and welcome back to my channel. In this week's recent reads, I have 5 books to talk about. Definitely a lot less than last week, about 2/3 less. Now, I didn't have a readathon, I had longer books. That explains it. So I'm going to talk about these in the order that I read them, at least the order that I remember that I read them in. And the first of those is Jackson Land by Stephen Skeep. Stephen Skeep is, I believe, still a reporter for NPR. I've heard him on there. I didn't know that he had written a book. And I loved this book. Now, before I talk about what it's about, I'm going to say this book is not for everyone. I loved this book because of the things that I tend to love. I have a bent towards history. I have a particular background with the case at the heart of this story. And so it appealed to me on that level. And also, Stephen Skeep wrote this really well. He has an engaging narrative voice that kept me reading, kept me interested. And on top of that, I loved the way that he expanded the story at the heart of this book. So the subtitle says, President Andrew Jackson, Cherokee Chief John Ross, and a Great American Land Grab. So a lot of people know about the Trail of Tears, the forced removal of the Cherokee people and other Native American groups from their homelands on the East Coast towards the Midwest, Oklahoma, at that point known as Indian Territory. Fewer people know about the Supreme Court case that led up to this and was an immediate predecessor of the Trail of Tears. And I first studied that court case, Winchester versus, I think the United States. I forget, not Winchester, Worcester versus something. And Worcester was a missionary that worked in the Cherokee land. And the Cherokees were running their land very similarly to the United States. They had a constitution. John Ross was the chief and the head of the tribe, of this, the governing body that they had. But the Georgians wanted them out. They wanted their land. They wanted to speculate on that land, make lots of money. They wanted to take it for themselves. I believe there was some resource discovered there. There was gold discovered there, I believe. I forget the law at the heart of this, but they take it all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is in its infancy as an institution, and John Marshall is just getting started with it. And the Supreme Court rules in favor of the missionaries at the heart of this case and the Cherokees. And I'm going to return to this in just a second because I need to change the battery. Okay, so I'm back with a fresh battery. Well, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the Cherokees, of the missionaries that were working with them. But Andrew Jackson doesn't care. The power of the Supreme Court, he doesn't acknowledge it. And he basically forces them out. Now, this book spends very little time on the case itself and on the events that happen afterwards. Instead, Skeep talks a lot about the events that led up to it. He talks about Andrew Jackson, he talks about John Ross, and he starts off by talking about their involvement decades before this happened, because a lot of the Cherokees actually fought with the Americans in the War of 1812, including John Ross, who served under Andrew Jackson, which I found fascinating. I didn't know that beforehand. So all that background to say, having studied this and having this be something that I had interest in and wanted to learn more about, this book appealed to me in ways that it wouldn't appeal to everyone. But I will say, the way that Skeep wrote this to keep me intrigued in American history, which is something that I have fallen a little bit out of love, well, a lot out of love with lately, and I've studied a lot, that speaks highly to the quality of this book. I really enjoyed it. I rated it 4.5 stars. I took off the little sticker about the points for Romathon, but that is in my genre and I will get page bonuses. I just don't remember how many it is and whether it was positive or negative. The next book, I do have the sticker still on, I listened to it as an audiobook, and I have read a book by this author before. His much more famous book, The Emperor of All Maladies. It is Siddhartha Mukherjee. I think that's how it's pronounced. So I'm going to talk about the points briefly, and I'm going to put the sticker away. So it's going to be negative 25 towards another realm, and then plus 10 because it's my genre, and probably plus 10 or 20 for the page count. I don't know that off the top of my head. So that book is The Song of the Cell, an exploration of medicine and the new human. So again, this will probably not be a book for everyone. It is very nerdy. It is very sciencey. Yet at the same time, Mukherjee has a way of relating these, what can seem like sterile, academic, scientific ideas. He can relate them to personal stories. And he'll put in, he doesn't overly compare and contrast things back and forth and make lots of moral lessons, but he puts in stories here, a short story or a line there. And it hits and it connects the academic nature of this book. I found myself fascinated all the way through, even though some of the stuff I knew, some of the stories I knew, but I just really enjoyed how Mukherjee tells this story. He does a fantastic job with balancing the real life effects of a very scientific, minute, I'm at a loss for words. He's not at a loss for words. This was a really good book, and another 4.5 stars. Next, and I don't have the stickers of points for this one. This one blew my mind with how much I enjoyed it and found myself fascinated. I knew that I had a high chance of liking it, but I also knew that there was a high chance that I wouldn't like some aspects of it and I wouldn't want to continue with the series. And that's Ninth Reign by Jen Williams. This series has been well loved across BookTube, starting primarily with Elliot Brooks. It's not easily obtainable in the US, at least it won't be until later this year. When I bought this book, I forget what service I used, but it came from Book Depository. So I believe this is a UK edition, which means probably if I wait too long, my editions won't match. But be that as it may, The Ninth Reign. This is a fantasy book, but it's a sci-fi fantasy blend. There's aliens in this story, and there's a lot of weaving together of alien technology and magic. And I have to say, Jen Williams did so much with this book that I've never seen in a fantasy book before. And it worked so well for me. I was a little nervous at first because vampires are some of my least favorite magical paranormal creatures. They're not my thing. And one of the races in this book, the Eborans, they're a version of vampire, but they weren't created to be that. So the setup for this, in this world, there are multiple races, and every so often there's a reign, a cataclysm, where the alien creatures, Orillium, I think is what they're called, they come in, they're starting to take over, they cause catastrophic damage. And it's really creepy, one of the ways that they do it. Some of these feeders, they go out and they look like, roaches, and they get into a person and they consume the inside, make them into a drone, a hollow shell. And that's how those people are killed. And then they have to be killed again. But anyway, the Eborans, which are the vampire creatures in here, they have one of their gods. I'm not going to try to pronounce the name of it because I don't know how to pronounce it. But every time this rain comes, something else happens, like the god wakes up and something comes from the tree that enables the Eborans to be able to fight and banish that alien race, and they have peace for some centuries. But after the last one, the Eighth Reign, something happened to that tree, to their god, and it's dead. Or at least it seems dead. And that's when, to stave off dying precipitously, the Aborans turn to drinking blood. And this makes them kind of outcasts to humans because it's whose blood they drink. This is set up in a way with a couple different prologues. There's, I think it's like 50 years ago, and then 9, and then 5. I forget the exact timing of it, but you're introduced to 3 characters. You're introduced to Hestilian, an Aboran, her brother, why can't I remember his name? Torian, I think. Anyway, her brother, another Aboran, who leaves, and then you're introduced to Vincenza, or Vintage, goes by Vin. I love Vin. She's phenomenal. Love her so much. And you're introduced to all of them. And then when the story gets started, you're introduced to another character. You're introduced to Noon. And then all of that, Jen Williams spends the whole book weaving this together, because Noon is a fell witch and can bring down fire, but that's also not liked by humans, and the Aborans don't really like it, and it doesn't really work with these different creatures. It is so complicated, so nuanced, and so well told. I loved how Williams told this story. It was absolutely fascinating. I've never seen something like this done before, and I've read a lot of fantasy, and a lot of the different tropes in here, a lot of the different ideas and things presented have been seen in fantasy before, but somehow in this story they felt brand new, and I really loved it. So I will definitely be finishing this series. Next, we have the other audiobook that I read this week. Some of the booktubers that I had seen that had loved the first one in this duology didn't really like the second one and were disappointed. I don't know whether it's because I had a bigger gap in between the reading. I don't know whether it was because it was the different format that I read it in, but I loved it. So I didn't get as many points with this one because it's not my genre, and there just weren't as many prompts to pick from, but I needed it to fulfill a class for Magical Readathon, which is another thing that I'm doing. I'm finishing Magical Readathon books. Ninth Reign, Song of the Cell, and Jackson Land, I believe, are all Orillium classes. This one is as well. It was only negative 16 points, but I do get plus 24 page count, and that is A Fire Endless. This story, I think one of the things that bumped this up for me even more than A River Enchanted was the love story between Adira and Jack was already established. I did not really buy their love story in the first book. It was supposed to be enemies to lovers, but I didn't really see the enemies part of it. Now, their romance has already been established. They've just been torn apart by the events at the end of A River Enchanted. And I read that at the beginning of last year, so it's been a little bit over a year. So there were some details that were a little bit fuzzy in my mind, but came back to me as I read this, and I believe it's significantly longer than A River Enchanted. But I adored this story and the way that Rebecca Ross wove together all of these different stories and these different ideas, and she brought in the Fae way more in this book than she did in A River Enchanted, and I loved that aspect of it. I think it actually opens up with one of the Fae creatures who becomes very pivotal in the plot. I almost went ahead and did this recent read before filming this a little bit earlier in the day, because I thought, I know I love it, I'll talk about it. I'm like, no, I need to finish it. And then it got to a point as I was listening with about 15 minutes or so to go in the audiobook, so probably about 50 pages or so left. And the climax of the plot happens, and something happens in that final cumulative ultimate part of the climax that, based on what had been going on, I knew had to happen. And I kept thinking, she's gonna find a way out of it. She's gonna find a way out of this. She can't leave it there. And then she did. And I went, no, you didn't do that. There's no resolution on this front. And of course, I'm being vague because it's the end of the duology. And I just was like, no, 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 no. But it fit. And I wasn't, like, I wouldn't have docked any points for enjoyment of it just because of that one thing. But it just almost felt like all of these other pieces have resolution. They're not, pretty and tight in a bow and neatly wrapped off. But this one bit does not have resolution, and it seems unfulfilled. And then the very last chapter happened, and I went, okay, thank you, Rebecca Ross. Thank you. We tied everything together. It makes a lot of sense. It fits. It's a fitting conclusion. I adored this book. I have not put it through copy yet because I just finished it a few hours ago, but I have a hard time imagining it's going to be anything less than 4.5 stars. It's probably going to get 5 stars. I enjoyed it that much. Now we come to what unfortunately I left off. I ended the week on, and that is one of my SCASL reads. So far this month I've read 2 of them. I'm planning on reading 2 more this coming week. They are both the junior book, the middle grade books, and they are sci-fi themed. And that book is A Line of Mars by Jennifer L. Holm. I thought the name sounded familiar, which it is, because I've read another book by her, but I don't remember that book. I just looked it up on Goodreads and I'm like, oh yeah, I have read another book by her. I don't remember it though. This had a lot of potential, but I found myself incredibly dissatisfied because, well, for 2 reasons. One, there was a lot of info dumping and explaining and almost like talking down, pedantic sort of narration in the early part of the book. And I'm like, I kind of understand because I think this is aimed at younger middle grade readers, but at the same time, you don't need to do that. And also in that same thing, so, okay, let me back up. The setup for this is it's a colony on Mars. And the kids in this story have never lived on Earth. They were born on Earth, but they were brought to this colony. And it took a while for me to figure out how all of these kids are here, whether or not they're related or if their parents are there. Turns out they're not. There's a system, it's called a nanny system, where a young person volunteers, they bring an orphaned baby from Earth, they drop them off, and then they go to whatever settlement they need to go to. So none of the kids are related and like biologically related, and they're not related to anyone biologically. None of them are like parents. Their parents are on there. That took a while to figure out, and I think that should have come sooner. The other thing that really bothered me, a little bit of inconsistency with them, with the main character, Belle, not knowing Earth things. Okay, that makes sense. But at the same time, Holm would also mention these, what they call digireels, so basically movies from Earth, where they would know about things that are from Earth. And so somehow he knows about courtrooms, but not grass. Make that make sense? It doesn't. The other big thing that really bothered me is the summary. What a person is going to read to decide whether or not they want to read this book. It says basically there's a major illness, all the kids are immune, the adults are not, the kids have to band together to save the adults. That illness did not happen until page 150 in a 250 page book. And the resolution happened 2 chapters later. That is not the driving problem of the book. And yet it's set up on the summary there like it is the driving problem with the book. If I had gone into it wanting that kind of a story, I would have been very disappointed because this is more slice of life, yet living on Mars. So there's other things that they have to overcome, other obstacles, etc. It's like one thing after another keeps going wrong and they have to fix it and they have to come together. There's also a point in here where it just seems like out of the blue, a character dies. And the main character finds them. When that happened, I went, wait, what? You did what? I don't think that was necessary for that book. This is not a bad book. I think something went wrong, like in the marketing or something. I could have dealt with the info dumping at the beginning. Maybe if the setup had been a little bit better, but I think a middle schooler coming to this book wanting what they read that the book is about if they picked up this, I think they would be really disappointed. But I'll talk more about some of those parts in my SEASL video. I believe those are going to start in May, but I'll talk more about that then. So there you go. There are the 5 books that I read this month. For the most part, I had, let's see if I can categorize this, because I also haven't put Line of Mars through Compile yet. I literally just finished that before filming. I had 3 4.5 stars. I believe another 5-star, and Fire Endless. Probably the Line of Mars is going to get a 3 stars because it's not terrible. Overall, I had a really high average for the books that I read this week, and I enjoyed my reading. Now I need to try to finish my TBR before the end of the month. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.